So what are the types of migrations? Well, we have forced migration and voluntary migration. Forced migration is not voluntary. You have no choice but to move. You are forced to do it. An example of this would be slavery, where individuals, slaves, are treated as property. They don't have human rights and they're forced into labor without their consent, against their will. So they have to follow orders of other people. And this system, if you know anything about American history, America used to have slaves. They were taken from Africa. Africans would sell people as slaves, and then they would be forcefully migrated across the Atlantic Ocean to North America, South America, all over the Americas. And they were slaves. They were treated as property, and they were forced to be used as labor, oftentimes on farms. All right, internally displaced persons. These are another type of forced migration. This is someone who is forced to leave their home. However, they are staying internal. They're remaining within their country's borders. So they're staying domestic. So this could be due to armed conflicts like civil wars, ethnic conflicts, or other forms of armed violence that can force individuals to flee their homes to escape danger. It can be generalized violence, gang activity, crime. This could be moving away from a city because the crime is so great. This could be like example in San Francisco. There's so much crime there that people have left and often cited crime as a major factor. So they're seeking somewhere that's safer inside their country. Natural disasters like earthquakes, floods, hurricanes. If there's a hurricane that destroys your town, you may feel like you should move away if you can't afford to stay there anymore. Droughts can also be a big reason. Volcanic eruptions can destroy homes and livelihoods. And all of these disasters would cause people to seek safer areas, seek shelter. There could be developmental projects like large-scale infrastructure, or development projects like urbanization, or even just dams and highways, or other kinds of developments that could lead to the forced displacement of communities. And farmers is the big one that should come to mind here when they build neighborhoods or even cities on what was used to be farmland, but now it is not, and farmers are losing their livelihoods now. We have political persecution as well. Individuals may be forced to flee their homes due to persecution based on their political beliefs, activism, or affiliation with certain political groups. They may just feel unwanted in general. Let's look at an example here of some violence, the Syrian civil war, which has been ongoing since 2011. It's caused over 6 million people to become internally displaced, so they're still staying within the countries. And this is due to various factions like the Syrian government, opposition groups, ISIS, Kurdish forces. They've all been fighting and causing widespread destruction and insecurity. There's been bombing, shelling, and ground battles. Typically, you don't want to live somewhere that's being bombed a lot. That's made many parts of the country uninhabitable. And it's led to the destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, and other critical infrastructure. People within these areas may not have any basic services. The IDPs in Syria often move to areas perceived as safer, such as government-controlled regions, or areas where there is a ceasefire or just the civil war hasn't reached there. Many seek shelter in informal settlements or some kind of camp, or were host communities in cities across the country. Some may find refuge in northern Syria. That's kind of what we're seeing as they're moving to the north or other areas controlled by non-violent factions or groups. Again, a lot of these areas are under ceasefire. What about Bangladesh? Well, they have annual monsoon floods. This is more environmental based that affect millions of people. So Bangladesh is low-lying geography, very close to sea level, below sea level. It's not very high. So it makes it very susceptible to flooding, and they're frequently hit by tropical cyclones. An example of this would be a cyclone in 2020 that caused extensive damage to homes, infrastructure, and farmland, as well as caused a lot of storm surge, so it led to extensive flooding. Particularly rivers eroded, causing land loss and the displacement of communities living along the riverbanks, and it rendered homes and made farmland uninhabitable, so that displaced all the people living there. It disrupted livelihoods, particularly in farming or even fishing, because the rivers eroded, leading to poverty and economic instability. The capital city is now a major destination for internally displaced people, and the city offers economic opportunities, infrastructure, and basic services. However, there's a lot of displaced people. So it's led to a lot of strain on these resources, particularly housing, because you have to house all these people. They got to live somewhere. So it's led to the growth of informal settlements, informal housing settlements, and has increased strain on urban resources. Many end up in these informal settlements or some kind of slum in the urban areas. And these are characterized by poor living conditions, lack of basic services, and vulnerability to further displacement because they're just not safe to live in. All right, what are refugees? You've probably heard this term and you're probably familiar with this, but refugees are people who are forced to leave their traditional lands, their homeland, due to persecution or material hardship within their society. They have to leave their country for their safety. So this can be due to armed conflict and war. People will flee to escape violence, insecurity, and potential human rights abuses. Persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership from a particular social group. This can force individuals to seek asylum, safety in another country. There can be human rights violations like torture and killings and arbitrary detention, and that can drive people to flee their home countries. That picture on the right here with the blue people, that is taken in China. They take Uyghur Muslims. They're called Uyghur Muslims. It starts with a U, by the way. And they put these people in camps to try to re-educate them and to basically get them to believe in communism and to believe in the Chinese government. So yeah, they just don't like them. China is not very tolerable. Then we have political instability as well, political upheaval, coups, which are unlawful seizures of power from the government, and oppressive regimes, which can create dangerous environments. The picture here on the far right is of the attempted coup in Bolivia, but it did not work. It was a failed coup, and it led to, oh gosh, my mic just fell. It's led to much violence and political instability within the country of Bolivia. Refugees are granted certain protections under international law, so internationally recognized, including the principle of non-refoulement, which means that they cannot be returned to a country where they face serious threats to their life or freedom. So people leaving Bolivia to seek refuge have a right not to return to Bolivia. Same thing like North Korea. We're not going to send anyone back to North Korea. Come on, it's North Korea. They have a right to seek asylum and receive protection and humanitarian assistance. Now we have asylum seekers, and a lot of people use these terms interchangeably. And in most common talk with your friends or anyone for that matter, that's fine. But in AP Human, you got to know the difference. So an asylum seeker is a person who has fled their home country, a refugee, and is seeking international protection, but whose claim for refugee status has not been determined. So they're not yet considered a recognized refugee. A refugee has protection, and an asylum seeker is seeking that protection. So asylum seekers are entitled to protection and a fair assessment of their claim under international law. They have the right to stay in their host country. They don't have to go back to their old country. They are typically provided with basic services, and those services depend on the country. So they can also have access to work, education, and healthcare, but it also can be limited compared to those of recognized refugees. Remember, they're not a recognized refugee yet. They are seeking that recognition. And again, that just depends on the country. They'll have an application that's reviewed through an asylum process. It may include interviews, evidence submission, and legal representation. And if their claim is approved, they're granted refugee status and the associated protections and rights in the long term. If their claim is denied, they can appeal the decision, or they may have to leave the host country. That doesn't mean they have to go back to their home country, but they just can't stay in the host country that they're located in. Let's look at the Syrian civil war again. So this conflict has led to widespread destruction, as we've talked about. Major cities have been damaged, and that's damaged essential infrastructure like hospitals and schools. Civilians face violence, arbitrary arrests, torture, extrajudicial killings. Chemical weapons have also been used, and 6.6 million people have fled the country, seeking refuge in neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and beyond. In Afghanistan, we've seen decades of conflicts, including the Soviet invasions in the 80s. We've seen civil wars and the rise of the Taliban. I'm sure you've heard of the Taliban. The recent takeover in August in 2021 by the Taliban has led to increased fears among the population. There's been severe restrictions on women's rights, freedom of speech, and religious freedoms. There's been reports of violence against people who dissent with the Taliban and their beliefs, and ethnic minorities as well. The country faces a humanitarian crisis with lots of poverty, lack of access to food and healthcare, and high unemployment rates, and these have grown because of international sanctions against the country. Many people from Afghanistan will flee to neighboring countries like Pakistan and Iran. They attempt to seek safety. There's probably not a lot of safety in Iran or Pakistan for that matter, but probably they're escaping their conflict in Afghanistan. So good for them, and they're seeking stability. They want to seek a livelihood. The journey is often very dangerous, though. Many face discrimination and lack of resources upon arrival. So is it that much better? Who knows? What about in Venezuela? This is really recent, actually. There's so much stuff going on in Venezuela right now. So Venezuela's political landscape sucks, and it's deteriorated so much within the last 10 years, and their economy sucks. They have hyperinflation, food shortages, and basic economic collapse, and that's led to widespread suffering. The Maduro regime has been accused of human rights abuses, including arbitrary detentions, tortures, and killings of opponents. Activists and journalists face harassment and imprisonment, and the government has undermined democracy. They consolidate power. They're power hungry, and they're restricting freedoms. Elections like the one in 2024 are often deemed unfair, and this leads to public discontent. If you look at the picture in the top right, it's a graph of the election results from this year, actually just a few days ago by the time that I'm recording this. And the percentages they gave don't add up to 100. They actually add up to 109. So the person who just made these numbers up didn't do it right. So yeah. There's high crime rates, gang violence, and political unrest. And over 6 million have fled, particularly to Colombia, Brazil, and other South American countries. And many face challenges in accessing basic needs and to integrating into these host communities. So here we have a map showing registered refugees in these countries. So countries like the United States gets in a lot of refugees. China gets refugees from North Korea. You can see North Korea doesn't even have any data. Well, it's probably zero. They probably don't take in any refugees. Greenland probably doesn't take in any either. But countries like the United States and China, Pakistan has a lot of refugees. Turkey, look at that. Turkey has over 1 million refugees. I'm assuming they're all coming from that Middle Eastern region as well. So yeah, our very developed countries, well, for the most part, our developed countries are taking in refugees. This map shows refugee populations. So we could see here, a graduated symbol map where refugees are located the most. Yeah, pretty interesting. We also see asylum seekers as well. That's why I included this map. So we can see what countries are taking in a lot of asylum seekers. South Africa, the United States. I would say Germany and France are taking in a pretty good proportion of asylum seekers. Even Thailand is taking some in as well. What areas are not taking in asylum seekers and refugees for the most part? South American countries, I would say. Western Africa countries as well. So yeah, pretty interesting here. I would take a second just to kind of look around at this map. Now, they aren't necessarily going, like, people from Syria aren't looking to move to, like, the United States for a big part of it. They're just looking to escape their terrible conditions. So they're going to move somewhere close. Remember, distance decay. So that's why a lot of Middle Eastern countries are having a lot of refugees, because there's just a lot of conflict in that region. Let's look at an FRQ from a few years ago. So this is just a basic FRQ on refugees. So the College Board's definition of a refugee is a person who flees, is displaced, or is forced to leave their home country. And then they had described one political, one social, and one environmental reason for why refugees flee their country of origin. So let's look at the political reasons. They fear for their life during conflict of war. There could be political persecution or imprisonment due to opposition of the government or an ideology that opposes the state, or they can be forcibly evicted by the government or the military. Social reasons include religious persecution, ethnic or racial persecution, and a big example of this is genocide. People may want to leave where genocide is occurring because they don't want to get killed. Or the rights or opportunities are denied based on gender or sexuality. Environmental regions at a national scale, that's pretty important, is natural disaster like an extended drought, a flood, or even a tsunami. There could be pollution or other human-caused disasters, epidemics or disease like Ebola. That was a big issue in Africa. Food insecurity and famine as well. They're going to seek areas with food. Using the chart shown, select a country of origin, so you get to pick one of these 5 countries, and then identify and explain one reason for why refugees have left the country here. So that's why I kind of gave some examples of what's going on. We learned about the Afghanistan and Syria conflict. You probably know a little bit about Iraq, maybe not, and then later on this course you're going to learn about Sudan. Somalia, not as important. Let's go through all these though. Afghanistan. So conflict and war, religious, ethnic, and gender persecution, and poverty. See, they even included the Taliban. So Taliban, you can say Taliban versus the Afghanistan people, or NATO, or the U.S. They didn't give any points for the USSR because the USSR doesn't exist anymore. Persecution, of course, there's been opportunities denied based on gender or sexuality. There's been food insecurity, lack of water, low infrastructure, education, medical care. Look at Somalia, conflict and war again, religious, ethnic, gender persecution, poverty, phantom, same thing. But you got to get a little specific and explain what's happening in that country. So in Somalia, it's warlords and the militia versus the United Nations and just the people in general as well. There's been persecution for Christians, other Sunni Muslims, and other groups based on religious and tribal differences, gender or sexuality differences as well. And kind of same thing as Afghanistan, there's a lack of water, food, infrastructure, education, medical care. Iraq, we have conflict and war, persecution and poverty, same thing as well. We saw the U.S. invasion of Iraq, flight or exclusion of Ba'athists, I don't even know, fearful U.S. collaborators, and then you just move on. If you want to read these, you can. But we look at Syria, they had a drought, so that led to a lot of food insecurity as well. So College Board wants you to know a little bit what's happening in the world. You don't have to know all these by heart, but I would know at least one of them. So that way on the AP exam, if you need to think of refugees, you can think of at least one place. The easiest one to me to remember is persecution. That to me is always the easiest one to remember. And honestly, I would remember probably the Afghanistan one because the Taliban is just the Taliban. That's the first one I think of when I think of something like a big persecuting group is the Taliban. All right, let's picture Oklahoma. So this is something cool I just thought to include. It's not refugees, for example, but it is forced migration. So mining processes in this little town in Oklahoma left behind extensive amounts of lead and zinc contamination in the environment, particularly in the soil and water. If you ever consume a lot of lead, you would get lead poisoning, and I've had metal poisoning, and it's not fun. I got it from a dented can of beans when I was in the 4th grade, and it was not fun. I don't want to describe it because I don't want you to get sick watching this video, but let's just say it wasn't fun. So this led to pollution. Metal pollution in the water, groundwater, surface water, making it very hazardous for residents. I wonder why. And it led to a very contaminated environment with lead poisoning and breathing issues and chronic diseases. And the mines eventually closed, and that led to job losses and economic downturn. It wasn't the pollution that really forced people to leave. They just didn't have jobs, so they left. It just shows the persistence they had. So some buildings were constructed near these chat piles. That's what these contaminated piles are. You can see the chat in the first picture there. Chat. I love saying that. Which were unstable and prone to shifting over time, and this instability contributed to structural weaknesses in the buildings, so they were very susceptible to collapsing. And you just don't want to be in a building when it's about to collapse or can collapse at any moment. So the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, in Oklahoma initiated a buyout program. They literally bought people's houses and told them to get out of here. And they moved them to relocate to Miami, Oklahoma. So yeah, pretty cool. Voluntary migration. So if you haven't figured this out yet, voluntary migration is not forced, meaning you don't technically have to do it. Internal migration is just movement within the same country, often from one region to another, usually due to economic reasons like a job. There could be better wages or just lower cost of living, schools, college, meeting your family, better government policies as well. Transnational migration is moving across national borders into a different country. Many will maintain ties to their home country. They may visit, oftentimes because their family's still there, or they may say reminiscence back homes and money you back, cha-ching to their family. Brain drain. That is transnational migration. What is brain drain? That is immigration, people leaving a country. These are educated, skilled professionals leaving their home country to other countries where they will have better opportunities like higher wages, jobs, improved living conditions, educational and research facilities, and better career prospects. So smart people are leaving the undeveloped country to go to the developed country, essentially, is what we see. So, for example, medical professionals from Nigeria have moved to the UK, Canada, United States for more advanced healthcare systems, career growth, and education. A civil engineer from Iraq may move to Sweden to enjoy a higher quality of life and safety. You don't see people from Sweden moving to Iraq. That's not really what we see here. So we can see here just a worldwide scale share of migrants within each country. So what country experiences the highest percentage of their population being migrants, or a percentage, maybe quantity is a better one here. So we can see the Saudi Arabia, Australia, United States, Canada, European countries. They have the highest amount of migrants within their countries. Pretty interesting here. East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, not so much. Brazil, not so much. Central Africa, Eastern Africa, not so much. What is this? What is this? Transhumans. Yeah, transhumans. That's actually how you say it. So this is the seasonal movement of people with their livestock, like cattle, between the seasons, summer and winter. And this is practiced by pastoralist communities who move in search of better grazing grounds for their animals. So these are just the movement of people who graze animals all day, every day, for the entire year. That's their lives. Herders will move to high altitude pastures during the summer and lowland areas during the winter. Because if you go to the highland areas in the winter when it's cold and oxygen levels are already low, you probably have a higher chance of dying, or your herd has a higher chance of dying, and then you don't have food or you won't get any money. So the primary motive for transhumance is the just keeping the livestock alive, which forms the basis of a pastoral economy. Herders move to ensure their animals have access to fresh pastures and water. You got to keep them alive. And this can be animals like sheep, goats, cattle, and yaks. And these are essentials to the livelihoods of these communities. They provide milk, meat, wool, and other products. In the Sahel region of Africa, we have pastoral groups that move their cattle northwards during the rainy season to graze on lush pastures, and then they return southwards during the dry season. So they have a very set system in place, and that's transhumance. And that's a really weird example that College Board makes us know, but now you know it, and you can brag to all your friends about it. So here we go. FRQ from last year. Describe one reason for the migration pattern shown on the map. So what we see here, the map shows pastoral nomadism in the Sahel region of Africa. And we can see natural areas, grasslands, that sort of thing. And what I'm seeing here is we are looking at pastoral nomadism, and we're looking at geography. So that's going to make me think of transhumans. So let's look at the reasons for the migration pattern shown on the map. Seasonal migration, transhumance, that's one of the responses. To move herds to grazing grounds or water resources. What about migration to areas with more rainfall during the dry season? Migration because the region's climate, arid or semi-arid, remember we're talking about Africa here, is too dry to support grazing year-round, and or to reduce stress on the land that's already been grazed. So they're going to move areas where there's more grass to graze on because they took the other grass before. Movement southward during the dry season, northward during the wet season. That's what. The last one is migrations based on cultural or agriculture practices. That's kind of a more broad one, but they still accepted it anyways, because many people may not know that pastoral nomadism is a form of agriculture. Remember all those goods and services, I'm not going to go back, that we can get from this, like meat and wool? Yeah, agriculture for you. Steppe migration, this is exactly what it sounds like. This is just moving in a series of smaller, less drastic moves. You're taking the stairs on your move. Example, someone trying to get to North Korea from the United States for whatever reason may have to fly to China or South Korea and then swim or take a boat or some other way to get into North Korea. Migrants will build social networks and connections through the various destinations that they go to, which can provide support and information for future moves. Researchers have found that migration often occurs through a hierarchy of places. As people migrate up the hierarchy of places, like rural to urban or a less developed country to more developed country, it's a hierarchy to seek better opportunities. Many migrants from Southeast Asia, like those from Vietnam, often move first to neighboring countries like Thailand or Malaysia, spending some time there and securing resources before moving to a developed country that's probably a little more expensive, like the United States. Migrants from Central American countries often travel to Mexico to save money or wait for an opportunity to cross the United States, whether this be legally or not. What about chain migration? Is this the same thing as step migration? No, it's not. Why would you assume that? There's nothing the same. Migration from a particular region follows others. You are following the crowd, particularly relatives or friends, to a particular destination. Migrants move to join family members who have already settled in the destination country. Migrants may be drawn to areas where previous migrants have found jobs, often within certain industries or sectors. Chain migration helps maintain cultural practices and traditions in the destination country, as migrants often settle in with close-knit communities, like Chinese people living in Chinatown. Migrants from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh have historically moved to UK cities like London and Birmingham, where earlier migrants from their regions have settled. Very interesting. Following labor agreements in the 60s, many Turkish workers moved to Germany for employment. And then there's been many waves where family members have joined the initial workers. So they're moving from Turkey to Germany because of that high Turkey population in Germany. Guest workers, we've talked about this before. These are people who move temporarily to another country for work, typically under a government or employer-sponsored program. These visas are usually job-specific. They're not just general go and find work, meaning workers can be employed in certain sectors or by specific employers. Guest workers can earn significantly higher wages than in their home countries, and that can improve their living standards, and they can support their families by sending this money back home. So there was a program in the United States for about 22 years that allowed Mexican workers to enter the country on temporary work contracts, primarily to address agriculture and rail shortages. It started during World War II when the men were out fighting and killing Nazis, and they needed people to work in agriculture or on the railroad. So they got people from Mexico to do it, and they continued to do this after World War II. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE employ millions of guest workers from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa, and sectors like construction and domestic work. European Union members often recruit seasonal agriculture workers from Eastern Europe, North Africa, and other regions to meet demand for labor during harvest seasons. To prepare for the 2022 World Cup, Qatar employed hundreds of thousands of guest workers, primarily from South Asia, to build stadiums and infrastructure. So all these are examples of guest worker programs. Rural to urban migration. This sounds pretty self-explanatory. You're moving from a rural area, like a countryside or a village, to an urban area, a very densely populated area, like a city. And this is typically in search for economic opportunities. There's usually more job availability or just different types of jobs in cities. There's oftentimes improved living conditions and access to more services and amenities. The growth of industries and services in urban centers attracts rural workers seeking better wages and career prospects. Cities often have better educational institutions as well as healthcare facilities, and that provides for a higher standard of living and improved quality of life. We often see more social, cultural, and recreational amenities like theaters, museums, restaurants, and shopping centers. Since the late 20th century, China has experienced lots and lots of rural to urban migration to cities like Beijing and Shanghai, and that contributes to economic growth, a rise in the middle class, and the development of modern infrastructure. The Industrial Revolution, when that started in the United Kingdom and spread through Europe, China, the United States, and those countries, that led to the first major rural to urban migration process. So let's look at another FRQ. This is from 2022. Explain the likely outcome on rural to urban migration as women gain greater access to education. So what's going to happen is women gain access to education, more people are probably going to move to urban areas because they're going to seek job opportunities, contributing to an increase, of course, in rural to urban migration. They're going to attend school. They're going to for education because traditional rural cultures have barriers that discourage or prohibit women's education. Women may migrate to cities in larger numbers, and that obviously increases the proportion of females in the migration stream. So all these are effects of women getting access to education and how they impact migration, particularly rural to urban migration. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really does help me out, and it costs $0. I have some free resources for you in the description down below if you'd like to use them. If you have any AP Human Geography related questions whatsoever, don't hesitate to leave a comment down below the video or send me a message on Discord. I'll see you guys in the next video, though. Adios.